Intro. Have you ever wondered how two parties can resolve a conflict without government intervention? Imagine a farmer whose cows keep wandering into his neighbor's yard. What should they do? Should the government step in with rules? Or can they come to a private agreement that works for both? This scenario brings us to a fascinating concept in economics known as the Coase Theorem. Today, we'll dive deep into the Coase Theorem, its assumptions, and the limitations you need to know. Why is this important? Understanding the Coase Theorem can help us grasp how negotiations work in real life and how we can solve conflicts effectively. Main content. So, what is the Coase Theorem? At its core, the Coase Theorem states that if property rights are clearly defined and transaction costs are low, parties will negotiate to achieve an efficient outcome. What does that mean in simpler terms? Say you have two people fighting over resources or property. If they can negotiate without high costs or barriers, they will eventually reach an agreement that benefits both. Now, let's explore the assumptions behind this theorem. The first assumption is that property rights must be well defined. This means everyone involved knows who owns what. Without clear ownership, it becomes much harder to negotiate. For example, if our farmer and neighbor have no clear boundaries, they might blame each other, and the conflict can escalate. The second assumption is the idea that transaction costs are low. Transaction costs refer to any expenses incurred when trading goods or services, like legal fees or negotiation time. If these costs are too high, it becomes difficult for parties to come together and strike a deal. Imagine if our farmer needs to hire a lawyer just to talk to his neighbor. That's a lot of unnecessary expense. The third assumption is that parties can communicate freely. They need to bounce ideas off each other and express their needs openly. This is especially key in our farmer-neighbor scenario because good communication leads to understanding and compromise. Now, let's dig into some real-world examples to illustrate the Coase Theorem in action. Picture a city with a noisy nightclub that disturbs the nearby residents. Here, we have two parties with conflicting interests. According to the Coase Theorem, if the nightclub owner and residents clearly define their property rights, they could negotiate. Perhaps the nightclub pays the residents a small fee to make up for the noise, or they agree on noise limits during certain hours. Both parties win. Doesn't that make sense? But it's not always that simple. Let's talk about the limitations of the Coase Theorem. First up, the real world often has high transaction costs. What if our farmer and neighbor can't agree due to the costs involved in reaching a solution? In many cases, people simply don't have the time or money to negotiate effectively. Another limitation is the presence of multiple parties. Things become complicated when more than two people are involved. For instance, let's say there are multiple neighbors all affected by the nightclub. The negotiation becomes harder as everyone has to agree on terms, leading to potential disputes. Then, we have the problem of power imbalances. What if the nightclub owner is rich and the residents are struggling? In this case, the residents may feel pressured to accept unfavorable terms just to reach a deal. This imbalance can result in an unfair outcome, contradicting the Coase Theorem's promise of efficiency. Finally, the assumption of free communication doesn't always hold true. Not everyone is comfortable expressing their needs or negotiating fairly. Some might fear retaliation or simply lack the skills to negotiate effectively. All these limitations show us that real-life situations are often messier than the ideal scenarios the Coase Theorem assumes. So what's the takeaway here? The Coase Theorem provides us with a valuable framework to understand negotiations and conflict resolution. However, We should always keep in mind the limitations when applying the theorem in real-world scenarios. Outro. If you enjoyed learning about the Coase theorem, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever been in a situation where negotiation could work? We'd love to hear your stories. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends who might find it interesting, too. Until next time, keep exploring the world of economics.